Okay, Shannon told me he's going to be getting here a bit late today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, so this is lecture 7 of the continuation bet. So lectures 1 through 6 were taking us from just absolute basics to covering all of pre-flop play. So we went over which starting hands to play, which positions to open raise those hands from and why, which positions to isolation raise, which positions to 3-bet, how to call raises, all of that. So we have at this point a pretty strong pre-flop game outline. So the next step that we're going to start talking about for this next chunk of the course, probably the next 6-ish lectures or so, is flop play. Whoops. So what is a continuation bet? It is a bet made by the pre-flop raiser on the flop, and it's sometimes made with a strong hand where we want to get weaker hands to call us. So if the flop is ace-7 2 and we have ace-king, when we bet, that's a value c-bet. We want to get called, we have a pair of aces, but most of the time, a very large chunk of the time, we're just betting with complete air as a continued display of strength. We don't have a hand yet, but we were the pre-flop raiser, and we're going to keep betting and putting the pressure on. And this is called a light c-bet. And all of today's lecture is going to be on light c-betting and when we should be doing this. We use the term light because bluffing probably isn't the best word. It's just betting when we don't have a hand yet. So it could be that we have a draw that's like 50% to hit, in which case it's not really a bluff because it's a great hand we're betting just for its purely strength, but we'd call it light. Yeah, and proper c-betting is huge. It is the biggest driver of playing well post-flop. It's so important that when we were studying pre-flop, c-betting came up a whole bunch. Like when we were talking about isolation raising, we'd say we like it if they're more likely to fold to our continuation bets post-flop. When we were talking about exploiting fish, we said we like playing with them because they're more likely to call our bets, that sort of thing. So huge deal.
Is it still like c-bet if you get a weak pair?
At that, I mean, it depends what you're trying to do, right? So we're going to go over different hand strengths in c-betting. If we're betting with the intention of getting called and we want to get called, it's a value. If we're betting with the intention of, hey, I really don't mind if they fold here, or I want them to fold here, then it's on the lighter side of things. It could be that we don't really care if they fold or call, kind of like middle zone. All right, so here, wow, yeah, red doesn't read very well. Here are the list of 7 factors affecting like continuation betting. So thing is obviously none of these should make sense yet, and all of today's lecture is going to be going over these factors. The important thing to keep in the back of your mind is it's really just common sense that, again, we're kind of putting into scientific terms. So when we're light c-betting, we're basically bluffing. So we really like it if our bluff is going to work more often, and we like it that if our bluff doesn't work, if they call our c-bet, then hey, we're still pretty likely to win the hand, or we have a lot of flexibility on our options going forward. So those are the 3 things that are really behind all these factors. First up is board texture. This is the most important one. See here it says good is texture dry, bad is texture wet. So board texture is the nature of the flop in terms of how it connects with potential hole cards. So dry flops have fewer ways to connect, wet flops more. The general trend across all of this is the drier the board, the less we're going to be able to c-bet light and bluff. The wetter the board, the drier the board, the more we're going to be able to c-bet light and bluff. I misspoke. And the wetter the board, the less we'll be able to c-bet light and bluff because they're more likely to have a strong hand. So this will make more sense as we go over these examples here. This is what a bone dry board texture would look like. Very hard to make a good hand. So let's start with king 7 2 on the right here. Can you make any flushes or a flush draw on this board? Can you make any straight draws on this board? How likely are you to make 2 pair on this board? Like impossible. Like you have 7 2, king 7, or king 2. There's no reason why you should ever have 2 pair here. The best hand that they're realistically ever going to have is a single pair. It's a dry board. It's very, very likely that they didn't connect with this board in any way. Similarly, for the 7s here on the right, well, it is a paired board. If they have a 7, they have trips, but how often are our opponents calling pre-flop raises with a hand that has a 7 in it? Like 8-7 suited or something, but they really shouldn't have a hand like king 7 or anything like that. So very often, both players are going to miss this board. We're going to have the same hand strength that we had pre-flop, And so we are incentivized as the pre-flop aggressor to keep betting, keep putting the pressure on. We're the ones who have pocket aces, pocket kings, all of that here. We have the advantage. We can start to bully. Last two things is if a board is like this where they're all three of the different suit, that's called a rainbow board. If there's two of the same suit, one of the other, like say 2 clubs, 1 heart, then that's a suited board. And if they're all three of the same suit, 3 clubs, that's called a monotone board. So we go from dry to bone dry to dry. So these boards are still very dry, but now it is a bit more reasonable for someone to have a straight draw or 2 pair or something. Like queen 9 suited is a hand they could have, or 6-7 suited is a hand they could have. They could also have 8-9 for the straight draw, 5-4 for the straight draw on the right. They could have Jack 10 for a straight draw on the left. There are more things here they could realistically have. Is it likely? No, but there's something. So we're still going to be c-betting a whole bunch here because they still miss almost every time, but ease off the gas just a little. Now here we're starting to get into the semi-wet board texture. So now if you notice, both of these boards have flush draws. There's a bunch of possible straight draws here, or maybe good pairs. On a board like ace queen 3, yeah, there's not as many straight. What just happened? I think this thing just, yeah, okay, yeah, it's good. All right. All right, there we go. So on the right, aces and queens, a lot of times people can have those kind of cards. Ace or queen, they can make a bunch of pairs. On the left, a whole bunch of straight draws can hit as well. And yeah, we're starting to get to the point where we need more factors in our favor if we were going to justify bluffing here with a light c-bet. Because it's very likely they could have a chunk of this board. They could have gotten a pair, like they have a flush draw, a straight draw, and so they're more likely to call our bluff, less likely to work. We don't like that. So yeah, I think your idea is probably coming through, hopefully, at this point. On wet boards like this, there's a huge number of ways they could flop a big hand here, and so we're going to have to really tone down the bluffing. As we get into these soaking wet board textures here, where it's just insane, so many flushes and straights and crazy combinations here, it gets to the point where unless we have a bunch of equity or a strong hand, we're just not betting. So the only time we'd really be bluffing here is if we had a ton of equity. Like say on the right board, we have like the ace of clubs or something. Then okay, I can definitely see a light c-bet because we've just got 36% to make the nut flush. But otherwise, even if every other factor is in our favor, they're a huge nit, yada, yada, yada. We just kind of have to be cautious on these. Oops. So here we can see kind of the spectrum, bone dry, all the way down to soaking wet board textures. It's just scarier looking. They can make more strong hands, less comfortable for us. So it is probably the most influential factor, not the be all end all, but huge role to play when we're deciding whether to light c-bet. First thing we think about. Any questions? Sweet. So yeah, this is one that too many words, honestly, but idea is kind of straightforward. Equity and continuation betting. So if we have reminders, so equity is our percentage chance. So don't even focus on reading. It's just too small letters and too many. Just I'll get the idea across. So equity, if you remember, is basically the percentage chance we have the best hand at showdown. So if we have a flush draw, then it might be 36% chance you make our flush draw. We have 36% equity. So we really like having equity if we're going to bluff and c-bet light for 2 reasons. So one is that the more likely we are just to win by having the best hand, the less we need them to fold. So if 40% of the time we'll just win outright by making our flush or some other draw, then we need them to fold an extra like 15% of the time to get to winning over half the time. So that's great. We really like that. If we were just bluffing outright, we might need them to bluff like fold 30% of the time. And then the second reason is implied odds. So say we bluff with our flush draw and they call, and then we make our flush. Well, now the pot is way bigger. We can bet way bigger and win a bunch more money. So If they call, we don't mind. If they fold, we don't mind either. That I was talking about earlier. So the next question then, if we really like having equity, is, well, how do you know how much equity you have? And it's just an estimate. We have to estimate against their calling range. So not just any hand they have right now, against hands they call with. We don't really care if they're going to fold anyway. Like, oh, I beat that hand that just folded. And we're going to do a few examples. It's going to show like how big of an important distinction this is. It could be, say we have like pocket fives and we flop bottom pair or something. The board comes like 7-6, well, let's say 7-6-2, and we have pocket fives. We probably have the best hand, almost certainly have the best hand. But if we go bet, 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 and they keep calling, like, we don't have the best hand anymore. If they're calling our bet, then we're not doing great. They'll have stronger hands now. So we really only care if they call. And if we have enough equity, we're pretty much always going to see bet. Like if I have a draw with 40% equity, I'm betting every single time. Flush draws, not always, but yeah. So quick rule for a refresher. Just remember that if we're on a draw and we're on the flop, we just take our number of outs and multiply by 4 to get the probability we make our draw. So 9 outs times 4 would be 36%, which takes us into an equity approximation example. So this is a lot of information. So I just say focus on part by part. First off, we raised with king jack offsuit to 3. We get a caller. This is the flop. We bet 4 big blinds and get called. So if they've called us, we're assuming they've got a pretty decent hand. And we're going to talk about this in a bit, but it's better to be pessimistic than optimistic. If we really wanted, we could be like, oh, what if they have a hand like 9-8 and they're going on the straight draw? But we should be kind of thinking more of like worst case scenario, how much equity do we have? So let's say villain has top pair here. We won't be too not generous to ourselves. We'll say they have a hand like queen 8 suited. How many outs do we have against a hand like queen 8 suited here? So we do have 8 outs to the, well, when we count 4 to the 9 and 4 to the ace. But yeah, also the kings. We got 3 outs to the king for 11 total outs. So based on that, we have 11 outs. What's our equity here? Yeah, 44%. So this is the part where I also lied to you. So we do have 44% equity, but by our just crude approximation here, but we're being really nice and generous to ourselves. We're assuming they don't have a hand like king queen or a hand like king 10, or maybe even a hand just like queen 10. They could just have 2 pair right now. But especially if they have a hand like, say, king 10, that king comes and we're feeling great about ourselves. We have top pair now. Oh, never mind. They've got a better hand. We're screwed. So yeah, in reality, when we're approximating with the rule of 4 and just on some psychological level, you tend to overestimate your equity. You start going, oh, well, I bet if I pair my jack here, like I've done this to myself 1,000 times. Where I'm thinking, maybe I have a pretty good chance to have a 10. I bet if I pair my jack here, I'm also good. And then I start kind of talking myself up until I realize later, wait, I overestimated equity by like 20% at least because I was just being too generous. So it's better to be pessimistic than optimistic. And we recommend kind of rounding your equity down. There's no exact formula here, but basically the more hands they have that could be dangerous for us or put us in sticky situations or block us, the more you'd reduce. So here, there's not that many hands that could suck, but in other situations where, oh, wow, I'm going to lose everything if they have king queen, then we would start to be more pessimistic. So back to this example here, 40% equity, even with the rounding down, it's an enormous amount of equity. We're just betting every single time. We want that extra fold equity, and we also want to build a pot now so that if we do hit our draw, we make a bunch. So yeah, this is just like a mandatory bet pretty much always with this kind of hand. Yeah, I can't think of ever not wanting to bet it. Make sense? Equity. So board texture, equity. All right, next example. So this is what I was talking about where the equity when called comes up. So if we raise pre-flop with 5s, villain calls, we probably still have the best hand here. The statistic is like 17% of the time you'll flop a pair and hold them. So 83% on average, villain hasn't made a hand here. But once we bet and get called, what are they calling with? Probably not total air. They very likely have a 9 or an 8 or a hand like 10 jack. And reminder that small pocket pair curse thing. If they have a hand, even ace king has 6 outs here. There's still 25% to beat us. We're not living life. So here, just not great. We're definitely not betting because we just don't have enough equity. It's uncomfortable. Now here, completely different. We have so much equity when called. Let's say ace 9 calls us. Well, we have 4 outs to the jack. We've got 3 outs to the 10, 3 outs to the queen. Like about 40% equity, round down a little bit. The key difference between these two examples is our equity when called. So right now, if you put pocket 5s all in versus king, queen 10, pocket 5s is ahead. They're more likely to win. But in practicality, when we're actually playing, we bet with 5s and get called. We hate everything. We're not living life. Queen 10, we don't care. We bet and get called. Oh man, I'm only almost half going to win just by spiking it out alone. Does it make sense? It goes back to those 3 things we care about: how often our bluff works, and then if our bluff doesn't work, how terrible is it? When our bluff doesn't work for 5s, we hate everything. When our bluff doesn't work for queen 10, oh well, I might hit a jack, I might hit a queen, I might hit a 10. So far we've done board texture and equity. And you're going detail with this.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. All right. Yeah. Just let me know when you're done. Take over.
Yeah, I can take some thoughts too. Just let me know.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't. Yeah.
No. What's
showdown
value? Cool. I can take this. So I think we touched on this in one of the previous lectures, if not multiple. Showdown value is a measure of how likely your hand is to win at showdown without improving. So this is usually referring to a hand that's ahead of a good part of the villain's range, but can't extract too much value by betting or raising and going crazy with it. So this is typically something like top pair, weak kicker, marginal kicker, and something even as good as 2 pair on a board where there's a flush or a straight draw. So you can look at the spectrum below, and this actually represents the strength of your made hand between air, which is absolutely nothing, say high card, and the nuts, which is an absolutely unbeatable hand. So the draws that we had and we looked at earlier have equity, but have no showdown value on their own. Because if your draw misses, you're left with, say you have 9, 10 of hearts and you're going for a straight or a flush draw. If all those brick, you have 10 high, which is no showdown value. So the equity for draws is called non-made hand equity, but since they can't win without improving to a great hand, they have no showdown value.
Just to make sure, equity versus showdown value is clear, right? Because yesterday's lecture, people were kind of confused on that. You good? Cool. Okay.
So, although we have had the previous factors be positive, hold on, I'm confused as to what that says. But for showdown value, until we get into a zone where we're confident enough to bet for value, at least we get until we.
Sorry,
okay, I'm confused.
I'll say that. I might have missed it.
Okay, but essentially, when we are c-betting and we don't, and unless our bet is for value in the sense that our hand is a hand that can get worse hands to call us at showdown, that's a c-bet for value, not a light c-bet. It's less good to bet with showdown value because when we have a hand that can win at showdown, there's no need to turn it into a bluff because we can still beat a good portion of the hands that our opponent is going to be calling with without needing to go crazy and start betting. So if we're only making villain fold hands worse than ours, then what's the point of betting and losing extra money to the better ones? So this is usually good when you have stable showdown value, but where your showdown value is vulnerable in the sense that you might get outdrawn later on, there's still an incentive to bet anyway to protect the hand that you have from getting outdrawn.
Sorry, I want to clarify real quick what I meant with those first 2 points. The drier the board texture, the more we're incentivized to c-bet light. The more equity we have, the more we are incentivized to c-bet light. However, the more showdown value we have, we actually want to c-bet light less. Once we get to the point where we just have a ton of showdown value, it's just for value. Because if our hand is so good, we can get called and still be ahead. Now it's not as a bluff, it's for value.
So for 6-7 of diamonds on a queen 3-2 board with 2 hearts, this hand has no showdown value at all. So it can't, there's no flushes, there's a runner straight, but it is pretty much 0 equity. And as long as you have sufficient fold equity from your opponents, you could actually, you should consider a c-bet here simply because of the fact that you have no showdown value, and thus you can c-bet light with confidence. So since you have, this is the only way that 6-7 of diamonds can win here is through folding. C-betting light is higher EV than checking with no hope of winning, because you can't improve on the turn or the river. If you c-bet light and you get them to fold, and if that's great. And if they raise you, you can just let it go since you have no showdown value at all.
Yes, quick point here. So some of you might have noticed, we just said we have no equity, so we might want to c-bet here as well. We just said before we like to c-bet with equities. You might be like, what's the deal? What's going on? You have to remember we're always weighing all of these factors when we're deciding whether to bet. So the key point in the second bit is with sufficient fold equity. So if we think we're going to get them to fold pretty often in a vacuum, this c-bet is good because we just have no way of winning otherwise. If we don't think they're going to fold very often, then we just would never c-bet here.
Yeah, you also want to balance what the hands that you're c-betting with. So for example, if you c-bet with 6-7 of diamonds on this board, and you would be doing the same thing with, say, a heart draw, that's a good balanced strategy. So you want to vary the things that you do, obviously, to make it unpredictable for your opponent. You take this one.
All right, yeah, so key difference between last example and this one is now we have a whole bunch of equity. We've got the open-ended straight draw, and unless they have a pair of queens, a jack and a 10 are also very nice to see. So yeah, here this is just, again, close to a mandatory c-bet. I'm pretty much always c-betting here because no showdown value, a ton of equity against their calling range, and we're gonna benefit from getting that extra little bit of folds. So yeah. On all 3 of our factors so far, the scores: dry board texture, we have equity, and no showdown. 3 things we like to see when we're going to bluff, so we bluff. Now we get into the vulnerable showdown value section. So again, I lament this every lecture. I'm going to start just making colors lighter. This is very readable on my computer, not as much here, but here it says no showdown, vulnerable, stable, value. So we just did the no. Now we're going to do the vulnerable section. So here we got a pair. Pair is pretty good. It's not a monster, but it's tolerable. And we're probably have the best hand here. And a lot of times we'll still have the best hand by showdown. And the thing is, though, is that this is vulnerable showdown value. So we have a pair now, but every card that comes off is probably going to make our hand worse. If a 9 comes off, our hand's gone from 3rd pair to 4th pair. If a spade comes off, there's a flush now. There's straight draws out there that get completed as well. So our hand gets worse and worse the closer we get to showdown, so it's vulnerable. So this is, again, a situation where it really can go either way. Sometimes when you have a vulnerable showdown value hand, you can continue to bluff and say, this hand is so trash that even though I have a pair, it's never going to be best by the end. So I should bet here as a bluff. Or it could be, well, it's vulnerable, but I might want to make it to showdown and see if my pair is good. Here for me, I'd probably lean towards this sucks. I could definitely see a bet here. So yeah, this is just kind of saying the same thing with more words. Yeah. So when you have showdown value, a vulnerable showdown value, honestly, yeah, just ignore a lot of words. When we're betting, we get 2 advantages. We protect our hand from being outdrawn. So if we manage to get a hand like king, queen to fold with a bet here, well, king, queen had 6 outs against us. Any king or queen, and then we're toast. So by betting, we can get them to fold before they'd win otherwise. This is called protecting our hand, betting for protection. And then also, if called and we are behind, so say we bet and then an 8 calls, then it's not the end of the world. We have outs. So yeah, this goes back to those 3 things we like. We either like it when our bluff works, and if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world and we have some flexibility. So here, one, we get protection, and two, if our bluff doesn't work, hey, I still have outs. So yeah. Now we're crossing over into the stable section, where we're definitely not going to be betting these as bluffs like ever. So here, a stable hand is one that's not going to get much worse. So there's no flush draws here, pretty much no straight draws. Maybe they have like king jack or jack 10 or something. But generally, we're never going to get worse than our second pair here. There's no run out that's going to make our queen get any worse than it is now. So we don't mind turn cards. And if we bet, villain isn't really folding anything that we are currently losing to. So if we bet, of course, any ace will call. And what beats us here except for an ace? Pretty much nothing. So this goes kind of the general whole idea when we're deciding whether to c-bet in a lot of situations is when I bet, which hands are folding and which hands are calling. If your answer is the hands that are folding are hands I currently beat and the hands that are calling currently beat me, well, then why are we bluffing? So this is a situation like that. If we bet and get called, it's typically by an ace. If we bet and they fold, it's by something we were beating anyway, so why did we bet? So this is a situation where you pretty much never see betting light. Frequently check this flop, and you can start to look towards value on the turn and river. So if it goes check, check, and the turn comes a 2, well, good chance our pair of queens is good. I'm going to start betting. I want to get money for my queen here. And then this is the value section. Now we're just betting because we want to get called. Key point, it is essential to build the pot. A lot of beginners will fall into this trap of, well, I found a good hand, so I got a good hand, so let's be sneaky. Let me check. Let me trap. I don't want to be obvious. I don't want them to fold. This is called the exponential mistake. We're going to go over more later, but the pot in poker grows exponentially. Pre-flop, it's 1.5. The flop, it'll be like 7. If we keep getting bets in, it'll go to 15, then to 35, and to like 100 plus in the river. So that jump from 30-ish big blinds on the turn, maybe less, to 100 plus in the river only happens if we bet all 3 streets. We're going to lose out on a ton of value if you don't start building the pot early, because again, our profits are going to grow exponentially. This is why you should be betting all the time. Tricky once and forever, but usually bet. So yeah, the spectrum here. And again, both of these hands have no showdown value, even though Jack 10 has a ton of equity. Make sense? So yeah, just again as refreshers, right now our factors are board texture, equity, showdown value. We like dry board textures, we like more equity, we like less showdown value when it comes to bluffing.
I can take this.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, you should probably just ignore all the words for this.
Sure.
It's totally
so yeah, multi-wayness. Essentially, you want to be playing against less players, because not only does this make it so that you're playing against other people that could have made a hand better than yours, but your fold equity gets a major hit. So if you just look at some of the points here, if you're heads up with one villain and there's dry flop and you can expect them to fold to a c-bet around 60% of the time, that's a great incentive to c-bet, and it'll usually work around 60% of the time without you getting punished for it. This is solid fold equity. But if you add 2 more callers and say they're even tighter than this old villain and will fold 70% of the time if they miss, you have to get through all 3 of them. So the probability you get through all 3 is 34.3, which is way lower, almost halved from the heads up scenario where you played against one player. So this is actually why isolating pre-flop and not limping is important, because you get out of these multi-way scenarios where your hand that's great in heads up now suffers because it's multi-way. So if you look at this example in a ace jack 2 rainbow flop, you have one player, so you're heads up on the button.
Yeah,
great position.
I'm betting absurdly often the button here is a bluff.
But if you have 3 people, even if you are in position, you have to get through all 3 of them, as said before, and this makes bluffing a lot harder. And if one of them, and you're also playing against their combined range, so if one of them has made a good hand and they call you, it's still not great to be bluffing them. So
yeah, you have just, this is one of those things that's so absolute. The more people in the hand, you have to be way more honest. Like a 4-handed table, or like 4-handed, I guess, hand, I'm pretty much never bluffing. Like I'll bluff if I see, wow, these guys are being really passive and I can reasonably rep this hand here and this and this. Like usually never. I'm just completely honest about what I have.
Yeah, it's like the worst scenario when you have like ace king and you raise pre-flop and you get like 4 callers, and then it's your hand just becomes it's worth a lot less when you have a ton of people in the pot, because now your good drawing hands are up against a lot of hands that could have made one pair and now have you beat. So really, really annoying situation, but definitely be very cautious about bluffing into multiple people.
All right, yeah, so this is less important of a factor, but it's still worth considering. So this kind of goes into the factor talking about where we like it if we get called, things, and even if our bluff doesn't work and we get called, things can still work out well for us. This option here kind of relates to having more flexibility, because there's a whole bunch of, the idea is there's a whole bunch of turn cards that could come that could improve our chances of either making a good hand or getting folds. So specifically, we either could pick up a card that gives us a draw, say we get an open-ended straight draw or something, or we get a scare card. So it could be there's 2 spades on the flop, and this 3rd spade will be really scary for villain, who always folds too much to flushes. Or there could be a card that completes a straight, or even the flop comes Jack 7-2. You have a whole bunch of aces in your range because you're the under the gun raiser or something, and then an ace comes on the turn. And we can represent having that ace a whole bunch, get lots of folds. So here's an example, and generally we like having better future street prospects. So the more we have, the more we want to see bet. So here is an example of poor future street prospects. And again, this might be fine if other factors are in our favor. So you can notice we have no showdown values. That's 1+. As far as future street prospects are concerned, not nearly as good, because there's absolutely no way we're going to gain any equity. We don't have a draw or anything that'll make us better hand. And there's also not really any scare cards, right? What else could come off here that would get hands to fold that wouldn't otherwise? Like a queen, a second king or ace or something, but not likely. So again, we could still definitely bluff here sometimes if the other factors align, but a lot of times we should just check. Fish don't like to fold here, so we bluff less. Here's an example of fantastic future street prospects, like some of the best you can hope for. So as of right now, we don't really have any equity. We don't have any draws. We got nothing going for us. But then you think about all the possible cards that can come on the turn. Any 9 is going to give us an open-ended straight draw. Any king is going to give us an open-ended straight draw. Any ace or 8 is going to give us a gut shot. Any queen or jack is going to give us top pair. Any heart is going to give us a flush draw. On top of this, because if our opponent calls, they probably have like a pair of 10s or something. If an ace comes, we were the raiser, and then we bet flop. A whole bunch of times we could have a hand like ace king. Raises pre-flop, bluffs flop. Oh, sweet, I just paired my ace. So that's a scary card for our opponent too, in addition to giving us a draw. So here I am pretty much, this is such a huge factor in our favor that I'm going to be betting off of good future street prospects almost alone, because there's so many turn cards I'd like to see that even if my bluff doesn't work, hey, it's not the end of the world. I've got options. Kind of the idea. So now we get into position. So this one is pretty complicated, honestly. So it's the same thing as always when we're discussing position, in that we gain information. There's a few other things that we like. So one is we have flexibility in seeing the river for free. So we're going to learn later, there's this idea in poker that if you weren't the aggressor on the previous betting street, you don't bet first. So say I'm in the big blind, the under the gun raise pre-flop I called, post-flop, when I go first, no matter what, I am not supposed to bet. I always check. It's called a procedural check. We're going to go over why we do this, but it's just a hard and fast rule. Everyone does it. So what this means is if we're the player in position and we're the aggressor, a lot of times what can happen is they check flop, we bet, they call. On the turn, they do a procedural check. They just can't go, they go first, they have to check. They can't bet first. Then we decide to check, so we get the river for free. That's the key takeaway of all this complicated stuff I just introduced. When we're in position, a lot of times we make it to showdown cheaper because we're the ones who can control the pace, we control the size of the pot, we control how the hand progresses. Also, we get more flop fold equity because position is so great of a factor. They're more likely to fold because they say, screw this, I don't want to play out of position against an aggressive player when I have air right now. It's a very uncomfortable place to be. So here is an example on the importance of position. If we were in the button, this hand absolutely going to light c-bet it all the time. You got backdoor straight, backdoor flush, and overcard with an ace. Typically going to be a c-bet unless other factors are against us. In the small blind, now what sucks is the big blind is incentivized to call because we're out of position. If we c-bet light, they call. Now, what are we going to do on the turn? We're going to keep betting. It's in a very uncomfortable situation because we're going to bloat the pot when we're out of position. There's lots of scary cards we could see, like a third diamond or something. So it's enough of a difference that in situation one, I'm typically going to bet. Situation two, I'm typically not going to bet. Yeah, I see some faces. Does this make sense? How we don't like being out of position when we're going to bluff? All right. And then last thing, we don't have it on the slides, but Teo is really emphasizing it in yesterday's section, so I want to mention it quickly. There's also this idea that certain ranges, based on your position, have more of a certain card. So say we raise from under the gun. When we raise under the gun, we're saying, I have pocket aces, I have ace king, I have ace queen, I have kings. We've got a lot of these big, strong, high cards. Do we ever really have like 3, 4, or like 6, 7 suited? Not really. So if the board comes 3, 4, 5, we typically don't have a great hand as the under the gun player. Now say we're in the big blind and we call a raise instead. A lot of times we're going to do that with 5, 4 suited or like 5, 6 or 6, 7 or pocket threes. So on a board like 3, 4, 5, they're the ones who make a whole bunch of the strong hands. So again, I'm going to do this more in detail later, but kind of have it in the back of your mind. The early position player, when they raise big, they're saying, I've got big cards, I've got aces and kings. And the later position, weaker callers are kind of admitting I probably have something that's like a 6, 7 or a 4, 5 in that range. Okay, so we've gotten all the factors out of the way. Let's go all the way back. So we like texture, good equity if called, the showdown value, prospects, and then the ones we didn't mention, but they make sense. Villain folds. We like to bluff if they're going to fold. That's the factor. So wait, whoops. So that now takes us into c-bet sizing. You want to take this or?
I'm still figuring something out.
All right. So we've just gone over when we're going to decide that we want to bluff. Question is once we decide to bluff, what size should we pick? And it's really important to pick the correct sizing. Big mistake a lot of beginners will make is picking the wrong size. I still pick the wrong size all the time. It's really an area I need to work on, that's for sure. It's really difficult. Key point also is it's not very exciting to talk about half big blind differences in bet size. Everyone wants to focus on the big pot where you get it all in with aces. But this is a situation that comes up like every hand that you play. So this is the one you really want to focus and work on first, these common everyday things. So balanced sizing. Again, a lot of words, but idea is simple. If you're playing a player who's good, we pick the same size for every bet. If I'm going to bluff, I bet the same size that I would with a value hand. Because otherwise I'm giving away a whole bunch of information. I'm very readable. If we're playing against a really bad player, what I love doing is I love betting huge with my value and small with my bluffs. If they won't notice, then why don't I want to bluff for cheaper? It goes back to this required fold equity formula. The less that we risk on a bluff, the less we need the bluff to work. But yeah, if we're playing any aware players, we need to use balanced sizing. I just wanted people to keep that in mind because the mistake a lot of people make is they'll say, oh, I read all this about these bet sizes. I have a value hand, let's go big. I have a bluff, let's go like third pot. So anyway, again, a lot of words, but there's two factors at play here. When we're deciding whether to decide a c-bet, we care about two things, the board texture and how strong our opponent's range is. So the board texture, we're thinking about dry versus wet. So on dry boards, we're going to use small bet sizes, third to half pot, sometimes even less. So the pot's like 24, we might bet anywhere from like 8 to 12. 3 reasons for this. So when we just talked about how we're going to bet with the same size with our value hands and with our bluffs. So we need to think about which size we'd want to use, not just for our bluffs, but for our good hands. With our good hands, we want to bet big on these wet, scary boards because there's so many like scare cards that could kill action. If there's a flush draw, all it takes is that third spade to come, villain will fold. Straight draw takes straight to hit, villain will fold. So we need to get our money now. And we also need to charge them. So maybe they're on this flush draw. If we bet small, we give them a good price to call. If we bet pot, we're okay with them calling with their flush draw because they're just losing money in the long run. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah. And the last point is that when the texture is super wet and scary, like Queen, Jack 10, we have a good hand more often. So we just want to build the pot more often. So we'd want to go bigger. Key takeaway, if the board's Ace 7-2, I bet 1/3 pot. If the board's Jack 10-9, I'll be betting like full pot. Second factor to use when we're deciding whether to size C bets is how weak our opponent's range is. So I'll say this A7-2 example again. Say we raise under the gun, flop comes A7-2. On A7-2, we have, as the under the gun raiser, we have a bunch of aces. We have ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10. We're the one with all the aces. If the big blind called us, they don't have nearly as many aces. So we have what's known as a range advantage. We're the ones with the really strong range here. They have a weak range. They don't have good hands. So we need to pick a smaller bet size to give them a more attractive price to call. Because if we just bet huge, they can just fold a whole bunch. On the other hand, if it comes so that it favors them, like the board is 3, 4, 5, the big blind can have a whole bunch of scary stuff. We need to go bigger because they have stronger hands on average. We need to get them to fold more often. We need to deny equity. So yeah, this part is actually pretty confusing. So please, if you have questions, ask. But we're considering 2 things at once. Drier the flop, the smaller the size. The weaker our opponent's range is, the smaller the size. If they have a lot of strong hands and it's a wet flop, then we go bigger. Make sense? I understand this is like, I was confused when I first saw this. It took me a bit to kind of wrap my head around what the hell. So, all right. Nobody has questions, I guess. Oh yeah, last thing. If you just need a size to default to, just go somewhere in the medium zone. Like you have no clue what to do, bet anywhere from half to third pot. So pot is 50, bet like 25 or 30 or something. Okay, final concluding example here. So what's the board texture here? What do people think? Yeah, wet, semi-wet, wet, that sort of thing. So let's say against a range it's going to call us is going to be a hand that has like a king, like a pair of kings. What's our equity here against a pair of kings? How many outs do we have, basically? Let me think. Yeah, I think we have 7 outs, right? 4 to the 10, 3 to the ace. 7 outs times 4, it's like 28% equity. We also have the backdoor flush draw, so we add on an extra 4%. That's 32, but then we round down, it's 30. Again, you don't really in practice do all of this, but for completion, we'll say we're about 30% equity. Now let's think range versus range. So we raised under the gun. They called from the button. Who has more kings and jacks here, us or them? Yeah, we have the range advantage. Yeah, we're the ones who we have the stronger number of hands. So to recap, board texture semi-wet. We've got a pretty big chunk of equity, about 30%, and we're the ones with the range advantage here. So should we c-bet, yes or no? Okay, seeing some yeses. Yeah. Board texture's in our favor. We've got a lot of equity. And then when we have this range advantage, it's going to incentivize us to bluff more, right? If we have more stronger hands on average, then we want to bluff because it really makes them feel the pressure. So we should c-bet, and it's kind of going to be in like the middle to high zone, right? Because the board textures is on the wetter side, and their range is a bit on the weaker side, but not too bad. So it could be anywhere from like half to 2/3 pot. Here I went with 2/3 pot, so about 5 big blinds. Yesterday, Teo said he would prefer a half pot size here, which is like 3.75. He's a better poker player than me, so I'd say go with 3.75. But don't overthink that part. It's just more of, if you have the right rationale, you'll get into the right ballpark. So here's all the factors once again. Maybe it's a good thing you can't read the red, you know? All we care about is the good factors. We want to do the good things. So yeah, these all make sense. The texture, the equity, the showdown value. And this does take a while to wrap your head around. I'd say I don't have like a mental checklist when I play where I'm saying, let me go over factors 1 through 7 really quick. They'll just be things that kind of pop out immediately. Oh, I have a huge range advantage. I'm in position and this texture's good. I'm gonna bet. Or I have so much equity, let's just bet right now. So yeah. All right. Guess again, yeah.
Is there ever a situation where it would be beneficial to play a multi-way pot? Like if I have some kind of nut potential and I want all these people with aces to call.
Yeah, we talked about that in the I think ISO Rays lecture, talking about applied odds. But yeah, it depends on our objective. So you just said it yourself perfectly. If you want people to call your bets, you want more people in the hand. If you don't want people to call your bets, you want less people in the hand. So if we have that implied odds, or we've got a monster hand, then yeah, I want a hand to go 6 ways if I flop quads. I just want somebody to call me. Whereas bluffing, nah, you really want it to be heads up, or at most 3 ways for a bluff to be an option. Okay, so yeah, keep trying to play correctly pre-flop. I can say that at yesterday's section, one thing I noticed is a lot of people were 3-betting and 4-betting the wrong size. So remember, when someone raises to 6 and you want to 3-bet, go to 20, not like 10 or something. So about 3 times, and a 4-bet is a little more than 2 times. So from 20 to like 40, 45-ish. And then think about the c-bet factors. It's very confusing. There's a lot of stuff, but you'll get the hang of it. All right.
Tables are in Discord. Think about the attendance question while you're out of the hand. It's pretty interesting. There's no right answer to it as usual. There's a lot of different scenarios that you might be in a tough spot for. So think about it.